know why I bothered to look down people. Yeah, she's very ungrateful because Michelle is the research librarian for the School of Humanities and Education Studies. I think the whole faculty. I mean, in my mind, Michelle is everybody's. She's research librarian for the entire world, basically. She's doing her PhD in ICVWW with Susan, in fact, on the Canterbury Persistent Scribblers. I almost called them the Desperate Scribblers.
After this, maybe.
Scribblers Society, she'll tell us that in a moment. She is also quite literally one to watch, because without Michelle, I can honestly say that the whole digital map project would have fallen by the wayside quite a long time ago. All the brilliant special effects and coding and things, actually some of that increasingly is done by students and by our fantastic DFE participants, but they in turn are being taught how to do it by Michelle, who until they rocked up was doing all of it and is still doing a great deal of it. So this is kind of, this is Mrs. Map coming towards us. She does write about the Scribblers on Kent Maps, but again, please go and look at that afterwards. That's ongoing. Don't look at it yet, because what I would like you to do is to listen to her talking about building castles in the air, imagined lives within and without Canterbury Cathedral precincts in the short stories and poetry of the Persistent Scribblers Society, 1875 to 1879.
Thank you. So is it here? Can they hear me?
Kate, are you there to put the PowerPoints on? At this point, we're going to find that we don't.
You do?
Yes, we do! Yeah, just teasing her there. We have a PowerPoint all the time.
Okay, thank you. It's not a particularly significant PowerPoint, I have to say, because there's only 3 slides I'm going to use of it. Okay, so the Persistent Scribblers Society, or PSS as I shall now call it, was a creative writing group established in Canterbury in January 1875. It began life as a group of 22 women and 3 men who wrote pseudonymously and was to flourish over the next 4 years. I got my date slightly wrong, it's 1878. Did that classic thing which you do at primary school, you can't add up your years properly, so it's 1878. And one of the common bonds of its members were their links to the established church. Grandfathers, husbands, fathers, brothers and uncles who were bishops, deans, rectors and vicars. These men were the social glue which brought the members together. Old school networks, university chums and professional alliances ignited family relationships. Scribblers came, scribblers went, and some persisted. I have called my talk Building Castles in the Air, Imagined Lives Within and Without a Canterbury Cathedral Precincts, and have chosen to focus on 2 members of the group. Mary Grace Whitewick, the 28-year-old secretary and founder of the group, who lived without the precincts in this rather fine house in the Dame John Gardens, which I'm sure anyone in Canterbury will recognise. And the other person is Mary Painsmith, the 17-year-old daughter of the Dean of Canterbury, who lived within the precincts. One we know used the pseudonym Gracia. The second, it is believed, is Silvius. The reason I've chosen these women is that they are the 2 most committed, persistent and successful members of the society. Over the 4-year period, Gracia and Silvius consistently jostle for the annual prize. Both later published short stories in the periodical press, and it was clear that they had ambitions to write professionally at this time. In reconstructing the lives of the scribblers through censuses, newspaper articles and the notebooks of stories. I have simultaneously imagined their lives as well as absorbed the imagined lives that they wrote about, and a curious blend of real and unreal has emerged. I have felt like the librarian in Virginia Woolf's The Lives of the Obscure, pulling these stories off dusty shelves. I have enjoyed and been frustrated by the possibilities offered by researching hidden lives. In the words of Woolf, gently, beautifully, like the clouds of a balmy evening, obscurity once more traverses the sky, an obscurity which is not empty, but thick with the stardust of innumerable lives. The relationship between the Whitewicks and the Payne-Smiths was a social one, and the families were not related. Robert Payne-Smith had been appointed as Dean of Canterbury Cathedral in 1871. The arrival of a new dean in Canterbury would have been an important event, and the Canterbury shops placed photographs of the new dean in its windows. However, his appointment was not without controversy. He had been recommended by Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, to a post in a city which was essentially a Conservative stronghold. Not only this, but the Payne-Smiths were overshadowed by the popularity of the previous dean, Henry Alford, and his wife and two daughters. When the Payne-Smiths arrived from Oxford, they would have sought friendships within the cathedral city. Thomas Norman Whitewick was a former mayor of Canterbury and solicitor to the cathedral. Both he and Payne-Smith were the same age, and they were both ardent supporters of middle school education in the city. They had wives and daughters who were similar in age, and we can see from newspaper reports that they attended the same social functions. For Mary Payne-Smith, arriving in a city she didn't know at the age of 13, and with the heavy weight and expectation that being a cleric's daughter brings with it, it would have been a daunting prospect. Her every words and actions would be analysed by Canterbury society. How was she to have a voice if her public self was inexorably entwined with her family's persona? Thomas Norman Whitewick's daughter, Mary Grace, an older and much more assured young woman, was firmly embedded in Canterbury society. She had recently visited Scotland, where she had joined the Ladies' Edinburgh Debating Society, and she had contributed to their journal, The Attempt. It was here that she attended the lectures of Professor Masson and was able to develop intellectually beyond the sphere of her family. Mary Grace had enjoyed writing for an audience in another country far from her family and connections. However, on her return to Canterbury, where her father and brother were men of influence, the opportunities for women were less. The city's youth society, the Young Men's Christian Association, although attracting large female audiences to its public lectures, was not explicitly for women, and they did not enjoy access to its extensive library and reading room. When the Young Men's Christian Association folded in 1874, the young people of the city were left without their space, and so the Whitewicks, along with their friend Walter Furley, were forced to take their entertainment into the drawing room. Cue Mary Grace Whitewick and the Persistent Scribblers. Often seen as a form of self-improvement, essay or writing societies reached their ascendancy in the late Victorian period. Popularised by Charlotte Mary Young in the monthly packet of evening readings for members of the Church of the English Church, you need to have your teeth in for that one, they were seen as a perfect occupation for young Christian girls, whose shorts, as it argues, were in need of more mental stimulation than the life of a Victorian daughter at home afforded them. Young had established the Goslings from her home in Hampshire in 1859. It was to last 18 years, and its methods were very similar to those of the PSS, in that members wrote stories and essays which were circulated. Whether Whitewick saw herself as a mother goose to her own goslings, we cannot know. But what we do know is that she established and ran a highly successful writing group for 4 years, nurturing the ambitions of young girls such as Mary Payne Smith. For Mary Payne Smith, joining a writing society with a few carefully chosen friends and family was a perfect way to express herself within a semi-private sphere. The original membership of the PSS is a blend of Canterbury and Oxford families, presumably engineered by the Payne-Smith and Whitewick families. And Mary clearly felt comfortable writing her often playful stories within this milieu. In her play script, Martyrs or Resurrection Pie, written in 1876 and set in Propperton, her writing is lively and enchanting. She is wickedly satirical of Propperton society and its snobbery. When her character Angelina goes to church in a holland dress and felt hat, she is roundly criticised by her mother-in-law when she appears completely nonplussed by her actions. What does it matter? What does it matter? Why, everybody is talking about it. Mrs. Cavendish Strutt and the Honourable Miss Seelys went to your church on purpose to look at you, and now, of course, they are dreadfully indignant. Angelina's mother-in-law continues by saying, I hope you may improve and in time become an ornament to society. When later her mother-in-law begs her to attend Canon and Mrs. Snubhamdown's garden party, she says that her husband does not care for the Snubhamdowns, and her mother-in-law replies, as for that, nobody does, revealing the hypocrisy of social relationships within Propperton. Furthermore, when her husband's uncle dies before the party, they are given strict orders by his mother to tell no one, so that they don't have to wear mourning. Angelina says, don't you think it's a great farce for us to go into mourning for him? Her husband Ted replies, of course it is. If he were not Sir Stephen Barehead, I don't suppose my mother would care a fig whether we went into mourning or not. In scene 4, when Angelina becomes unwell, presumably as a result of her desultory marriage, her childhood friend, Sir Sylvius Slap-'em-all, takes for a jolly good trip hopping in her father's spring cart, revealing that the scene is indeed Kent and she is a country farmer's daughter. At the end of the play script, Mary Payne Smith writes, indirect moral, don't be punny at the expense of your friend's relations. She gets 15 votes for the piece. 6 of these are from members of the Whitewick family, and it's possible that she's observed characters like these in her social milieu, and that her friends are acknowledging this. Mary Payne Smith parodies life outside the precincts with acuity, and her audience love it. For Mary, the PSS provided her with a liminal space between the cathedral precincts and Canterbury society. She could be freer to express her thoughts in the notebooks, even under the watchful eye of mother, aunt and sisters. Mary, via her pseudonym, she claimed to be a man, was able to say things she clearly thought on the ridiculous nature of mourning, of the enslaving nature of marriage, which she was not empowered to express in public. In another script about the lives of Ted and Angelina, she writes, the moral is, do not marry. And if you do marry, do not go on a honeymoon. And if you do go on a honeymoon, take wet weather gear and something to do in the evenings. This reveals her desire for self-expression, which was squashed by her duty as a dean's daughter. Writing was a double-edged sword for the children of clergy. It was simultaneously a family industry, with worthy writing declaring moral rectitude and guidance to their flock, and expectation, but one that may not have allowed the self-expression that Mary craved. writing provided her with an outlet. But what is different about her notebook content and that of her later, maturer writing is that it is private rather than a public voice. Indeed, the Persistent Scribblers was an important outlet for women like Mary, confined by societal expectations which were stronger than the physical barriers of the precinct where she lived. Mary's published works, which appear 7 years later, veer between serious and preachy and traditionally romantic. She seems more aware of her responsibility as the daughter of a dean when publishing under her own name. In her 1887 story, An Old Love, published in Cassell's magazine, she presents a naive, girlish view of love when her heroine, Madge, who is deliberating about whether to accept an offer of marriage, tells her aunt, "I should like to marry a man I should look up to ever so much and revere, and never dream of disobeying." Her character is unlike the comedic Angelina, and ironically called Madge, Mary Grace Whitewick's pet name. Similarly, Mary Payne Smith endorses marriage in her article, The Disadvantages of Higher Education, and criticises independent women. Just a short walk away, Mary Grace Whitewick, who lived without of the precincts and the driving force behind the society, contributed a mix of poetry and short stories which were curiously unradical, despite her experiences in Scotland, and did not challenge the status quo in the way that Mary Payne Smith did. She received plenty of votes from the subscribers for her accomplished writing, but it was dull in comparison. Many of her notebook stories and poetry were later published to lukewarm reviews. Her first serialised novel, In Land of Palms, published in 1881, was described as promising to be a tolerably amusing little novel, though the result of the love complications of the rather characterless English, semi-English and German ladies and gentlemen is easy to guess. However, when Mary Grace Whitewick breaks away from her notebooks and the prying eyes of her peer group, her writing becomes more exciting. She seems to be liberated without the constraints of writing for family and friends. In her 1883 serialised story, Mrs. Carr's Companion, published in the Argosy, she writes an imagined picture of life within the precincts, revealing her intimate knowledge of life within it. The story is set in the close of St. Brenda's Cathedral, a cathedral which is described as close enough to the Channel so that a wedding fixed for 10 o'clock allowed the bridal pair time to cross the Channel that same afternoon. This suggests Canterbury or Rochester, London at a stretch. The Archdeacon bears an uncanny resemblance to Dean Robert Payne Smith. Whitewick wrote, "The qualifications fitting the Archdeacon to become a dignitary of the Cathedral Church of St. Brenda, where the kindly old gentleman occasionally read inaudible lessons from the great brazen eagle and preached in his turn learned discourses that were caviar to the multitude, were a profound knowledge of Assyriology and a strongly developed taste for the deciphering of cuneiform records." Robert Payne Smith was a noted Syriac scholar, but also noted for not completing his magnus opus. Mary Grace Whitewick continues, "The visitors looked awed at this mention of the Archdeacon's literary work. It was generally understood in St. Brenda's that Archdeacon Egerton used his pen a great deal, and although the fruits of his toil did not transpire to the world at large, perhaps the vague nature of his studies enveloped them with additional interest and distinction. St. Brenda's was very proud of that great literary light that condescended to shine in its midst." Similarly, Olive Egerton, the Archdeacon's niece, is similar in many respects to Mary Payne Smith's sister Jessie, who acted as her father's assistant in his studies. Olive, who never cared to waste time, sat at the central table, engrossed with foreign books and dictionaries, leaving her coffee untasted. Olive also sketches a ruined archway in the cathedral ground, and there are examples of Jessie Payne Smith's sketches in Canterbury Cathedral archives. How the Payne Smiths felt About having their life fictionalised by a near neighbour and friend, we will never know. But we may assume that this was written after the demise of the society. What the PSS had done was give Mary Grace Whitewick access to a life she did not inhabit and observe it at close quarters. When she wrote, devotion was made easy to the close families in the midst of armchairs and velvet cushions. But even a velvet cushion may be stuffed with thorns, and the balance of mental ease between the tenants of higher and those of the lower seats in the synagogue is more equal than people imagine. She gives us an insight into the life of the Payne-Smiths, which even Mary Payne-Smith was unable to disclose. Mary Grace Whitewick had done the unspeakable. She had exposed friends not to their faces in a comedic parody, but in public. Anyone who knew Mary Grace Whitewick would have known of her friendship with the Payne-Smiths, and could not have failed to have drawn the analogies between the fiction and the truth. Mary Payne-Smith had clearly seen their relationship, despite the age gap, as a close one, as she described their imagined future lives as the honoured Honorary Secretary Gracia and her lifelong friend and able coadjutor Sylvius. Whitewick's story must have felt a betrayal. It could be that when the character of Lady Mary Egerton in Mrs. Carr's Companion says, I may leave a card, as she lives so near, but I will have no intimacy between my daughters and those rather fast girls of hers, that Mary Grace Whitewick is expressing a breakdown in the relations between the families. Maybe she never felt comfortable with their high church superiority. There are other clues to tensions within their relationships. Mary Grace Whitewick describes the thick, uncompromising paper bearing the Egerton arms on a lozenge. This is a clue perhaps to the deanery paper used by Catherine Payne-Smith, which was used for some of her contributions to the PSS. Mary Payne-Smith documents the end of the PSS in her story, Old Lang Syne, or What Might Have Been a Glimpse of the Future. The society was on the brink of collapse in the autumn of 1878. And Gracia, alas, was gracefully idle. Mary Payne-Smith hints that Mary Grace is unable to raise her voice above the prescribed whisper which her doctors allowed. As the PSS collapsed, so did the world of the Archdeacon's family at St Brenda's, in their imagined precincts. Rose elopes, Olive becomes engaged to an architect, and Lady Mary felt a strange dryness in her throat, and for a moment found a difficulty in swallowing. She paused to smooth back the lace of her wrapper before she spoke again, and in the pause, the last and proudest of her castles in the air came tumbling in ruins about her. We may never know how the real story plays out, whether the rivalry between the two Marys became too much, or whether Whitewick just wearied of her amateur group. What we do know is that both women wrote about the imagined lives of the other, within and without of the precincts. Thank you.